Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to join in fellowship of sharing one another's insights and the riches that we find in the text written down on the pages before us and the riches of the text in the lives that are in front of us as well. We are in Parshat Tazria-Metzora, which begins in the book of Leviticus with chapter 12, verse 1. We'll read through the English translation of our portion. I'll share with you a focused study about it, and then we'll open it up for our collaborative conversation about it. We can begin by saying our blessing, and if you'd like to go ahead and unmute at this point, we can together recite our blessing, giving thanks for being in this moment together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher ksanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for this moment and this opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. I'll share with you the opening verses, and then I'll invite others to have an opportunity to read some verses as well. Book of Leviticus, chapter 12, verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people thus. When a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean as at the time of her menstrual infirmity. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, and she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed. If she bears a female, she shall be unclean 2 weeks as during her menstruation, and she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 66 days. And then Kath, would you like to read a little bit starting at verse 6?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. On the completion of her period of purification for either son or daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or turtle dove for a sin offering. He shall offer it before the Lord and make expiation on her behalf. She shall then be clean from her flow of blood. Such are the rituals concerning her who bears a child, male or female. If, however, her means do not suffice for a sheep, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. The priest shall make expiation on her behalf, and she shall be clean.
Thank you. Joni, you want to read the very start of chapter 13?
Thank you.
Yeah.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling, a rash, or a discoloration, and it develops into a scaly affection on the skin of his body, it shall be reported to Aaron, the priest, or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest shall examine the affection on the skin of his body. If hair in the affected patch has turned white, and the affection appears to be deeper than the skin of the body, it is leprous affection. When the priest sees it, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if it is a white discoloration on the skin of his body, which does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest shall isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him. And if the affection has remained unchanged in color and the disease has not spread on the skin, the priest shall isolate him for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him again. If the affection has faded and has not spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is a rash. He shall wash his clothes and he shall be clean. But if the rash should spread on the skin after he has presented himself to the priest and been pronounced clean, he shall present himself again to the priest. And if the priest sees that the rash has spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy.
Thank you so much. Richard, you want to read there verse 9?
Thank you. When a person has a scaly affection, it shall be reported to the priest. If the priest finds on the skin a white swelling, which has turned some hair white, with a patch of undiscolored flesh in the swelling, it is chronic leprosy on the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He need not isolate him, for he is unclean. But if the eruption spreads out over the skin so that it covers all of the skin of the affected person from head to foot, wherever the priest can see, if the priest sees that the eruption has covered the whole body, he shall pronounce the affected person clean, since he has turned all white, he is clean. But as soon as undiscolored flesh appears in it, he shall be unclean. When the priest sees the undiscolored flesh, he shall pronounce him unclean. The undiscolored flesh is unclean. It is leprosy. But if the undiscolored flesh again turns white, he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. If the affection has turned white, the priest shall pronounce the affected person clean. He is clean.
Thank you. Jerry, you want to read there verse 18?
Thank you. When an inflammation appears on the skin of one's body and it heals, and a white swelling or a white discoloration streaked with red develops where the inflammation was, he shall present himself to the priest. If the priest finds that it appears lower than the rest of the skin and that the hair on it has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous affection and broken out in the inflammation. But if the priest finds there is no white hair in it, and it is not lower than the rest of the skin, and it is faded, the priest shall isolate him for 7 days. If it should spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an affection. But if the discoloration remains stationary, not having spread, it is the scar of the inflammation. The priest shall pronounce him clean.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to read there at verse 24?
Oh, when the skin of one's body sustains a burn by fire, and the patch from the burn is a discoloration, either white streaked with red or white, the priest shall examine it. If some hair is turned white in the discoloration, which itself appears to go deeper in the skin, it is leprosy that is broken out in the burn. The priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous affection. But if the priest finds there is no white hair in the discoloration, and it is not lower than the rest of the skin, and it is faded, the priest shall isolate him for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him. If it is spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce it unclean. It is a leprous affection. But if the discoloration remains stationary, not having spread on the skin, it is faded. It is the swelling from the burn. The priest shall pronounce it clean, but it is the scar of the burn.
Thank you. And June, would you like to read starting at verse 29?
Thank you, Rabbi. If a man or a woman has an affection on the head or in the beard, the priest shall examine the affection. If it appears to go deeper than the skin, and there is thin yellow hair in it, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a scald, a scaly eruption in the hair or beard. But if the priest finds that the scald affection does not appear to go deeper than the skin, yet there is no black hair in it, the priest shall isolate the person with the scald affection for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine the affection. If the scald has not spread and no yellow hair has appeared in it, and the scald does not appear to go deeper than the skin, the person with the scald shall shave himself, but without shaving the scald. The priest shall isolate him for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine the scald. If the scald has not spread on the skin and does not appear to go deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. He shall wash his clothes, and he shall be clean. If, however, the the scale should spread on the skin after he has been pronounced clean, the priest shall examine him. If the scale has spread on the skin, the priest need not look for yellow hair. He is unclean. But if the scale has remained unchanged in color and black hair has grown in it, the scale is healed, he is clean. The priest shall pronounce him clean.
Thank you so much. And then Rose, would you like to read starting at verse 38? And then you need to unmute. You'll need to unmute, Rose. Thank you.
If a man or a woman has the skin of the body streaked with white discoloration, and the priest sees a discoloration on the skin of the body or of a dull white, it is a tetter broken out on the skin. That person is pure. If a man loses the hair of his head and becomes bald, he is pure. If he loses the hair on the front part of his head and becomes bald at the forehead, he is pure. But if a white affection streaked with red appears on the bald part in the front or the back of the head, it is a scaly eruption that is spreading over the bald part in the front or the back of the head. The priest shall examine him. If the swollen affection on the bald part in the front or the back of the head is white streaked with red, like the leprosy of body, skin, and appearance, he is a leprous man. He is impure. The priest shall pronounce him impure. He has the affection on his head.
Thank you so much. And let me invite Paul, would you like to read starting at verse 45?
Thank you, Rabbi. You know, a person that doesn't have too much hair, I feel a little pure now. Okay, and the person with the tsaros in whom there is the affliction, his garments shall be rent. The hair of his head shall be unshorn, and shall cloak himself up to his lips. He is to call out, contaminated, contaminated. All the days that the affliction is upon him, he shall remain contaminated. He is contaminated. He shall dwell in isolation. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. If there shall be a tsaros affliction in a garment, in a woolen garment, or a linen garment, or the wrap, or the warp of the woof of the linen, or the wool, or in leather, or in anything fashioned of leather, and the affliction shall be deep green or deep red in the garment, or the leather, or the warp of the woof, or in any leather utensil, it is a tsaros affliction, and it shall be shown to the Kohen. The Kohen shall look at the affliction, and he shall quarantine the affliction for a 7-day period. He shall look at the affliction on the 7th day, and if the affliction has spread in the garment, or in the warp, or in the woof, or in the leather, for whatever purpose the leather has been fashioned, the affliction is a malignant tsaros. It is contaminated. He shall burn the garment, or the warp, or the woof, or the wool, or the linen, or any leather utensil in which the affliction may be, for it is a malignant tsaros. It shall be burnt in fire. But if the Kohen shall look, and behold, the affliction had not spread in the garment, or the warp, or the woof, or in any leather utensil, the Kohen shall command, and they shall wash the area of the affliction, and he shall quarantine it for a second 7-day period. The Kohen shall look after the affliction has been washed, and behold, the affliction has not changed its color, and the affliction has not spread. It is contaminated, you shall burn it in fire. It is a penetrating affliction in his worn garment, or in his new garment. But if the Kohen shall look, and behold, the affliction grew dimmer after it was washed, he shall rip it from the garment, or from the leather, or from the warp, or from the woof. If it appears again in the garment, or in the warp, or in the woof, or in any leather utensil, it is an eruption. You shall burn it in fire, that which contains the affliction. But if the garment or the warp or the woof or any further utensil had been washed, and the affliction left them, it shall be immersed again and shall become pure. This is the law of the Tsar's affliction. A garment of wool or linen, or the warp or the woof, or any leather utensil, to declare it pure or declare it contaminated.
Thank you, Paul. And Mark Thompson, would you like to read at the very start of chapter 14?
Thank you. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the ritual for a leper at the time that he is to be cleansed. When it has been reported to the priest shall go outside the camp. The priest sees that the leper has been healed of his scaly affection. The priest shall order 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, crimson stuff, and hyssop to be brought for him who is to be cleansed. The priest shall order one of the birds slaughtered over fresh water in an earthen vessel, and he shall take the live bird along with the cedar wood, the crimson stuff, and the hyssop, and dip them together with the live bird in the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. He shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the eruption, and cleanse him. And he shall set the live bird free in the open country. The one to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and bathe in water, then he shall be clean. After that he may enter the camp. But he must remain outside his tent 7 days. On the 7th day he shall shave off all his hair of head, beard, and eyebrows. When he has shaved off all his hair, he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, then he shall be clean. On the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, 1 ewe lamb in the first year without blemish, 3/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in for a meal offering, and 1 log of oil. These shall be presented before the Lord with the man to be cleansed at the entrance of the tent of meeting by the priest who performs the cleansing."
Thank you so much, Mark. And David and Susan, would you like to continue there at verse 12? And you'll need to unmute David and Susan.
I tried. Now I succeeded.
And the priest shall take the 1 sheep and bring it forward as a guilt offering, and the log of oil, and he shall elevate them as an elevation offering before the Lord. And he shall slaughter the sheep in the place where the offense offering is slaughtered, and the burnt offering in the place of the sacred zone. For offense offering and guilt offering alike are the priests. It is holy of holies. And the priest shall take from the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the right earlobe of him who is cleansing himself, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the priest shall take from the log of oil and pour it into the left palm of the priest, and the priest shall dip his right finger into the oil that is in his palm, and sprinkle from the oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord.
And the priest shall put some of the remaining oil that is on his hand on the right earlobe of the one being purified, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, over the blood of the guilt offering. And he shall put what is left of the oil that's in the priest's hand on the head of the one being purified, and the priest shall make atonement over him in front of Hashem. And the priest shall make the sin offering and make atonement over the one being purified from his impurity. And after that, he shall slaughter the burnt offering, and the priest shall make the burnt offering and the grain offering at the altar. And the priest shall make atonement over him, and he will be pure.
Thank you so much, both of you. Wendy, would you like to do a little reading? We're at verse 21 of chapter 14.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. If, however, he is poor and his means are insufficient, he shall take 1 male lamb for a guilt offering to be waved in expiation for him, 1/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in for a meal offering, and a log of oil, and 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, which, where I am.
verse 22.
Mhm. Yeah, and 2 turtle doves and 2 pigeons which are within his means, the one to be the sin offering and the other the burnt offering. On the 8th day of his cleansing, he shall bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest shall take the lamb of guilt offering and the log of oil and wave them as a wave offering before the Lord. When the lamb of guilt offering has been slaughtered, the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the ridge of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The priest shall then pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and with the finger of his right hand, the priest shall sprinkle some of the oil that is in the palm of his left hand 7 times before the Lord. Some of the oil in his palm shall be put by the priest on the ridge of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, over the same places as the blood of the guilt offering. And what is left of the oil in his palm, the priest shall put on the head of the one being cleansed to make expiation for him before the Lord. He shall then offer one of the turtle doves or pigeons, depending on his means, whichever he can afford. The one is a sin offering and the other is a burnt offering, together with a meal offering. Thus the priest shall make expiation before the Lord for the one being cleansed. Such shall the ritual for him who has a scaly affection and whose means for his cleansing are limited.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much. And then Robert, would you like to continue there at verse 33?
Yes, thank you. And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, when ye be come into the land of Canaan, which I give to you for possession, and I put the plague of leprosy in a house of the land of your possession, and he that owneth the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, it seemeth to me there is as it were a plague in the house. Then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priests go into it to see the plague, that all that is in the house be not made unclean. And afterward the priest shall go into the house, into see the house. And he shall look on the plague, and behold, if the plague be in the walls of the house with hollow strakes, greenish or red, which in sight are lower than the wall, then the priest shall go out of the house to the door of the house and shut up the house 7 days. And the priest shall come again the 7th day and shall look, and behold, if the plague be spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they take away the stones in which the plague is, and they shall cast them into an unclean place without the city. And he shall cause the house to be scraped within round about, and they shall pour out the dust that they scrape off without the city into an unclean place. And they shall take other stones and put them in the place of those stones. And he shall take other mortar and shall plaster the house.
Thank you, Robert. Jay, would you like to do some reading starting at verse 43?
Certainly. Thank you, Rabbi. If the plague again breaks out in the house, after the stones have been pulled out, and after the house has been scraped and replastered, the priest shall come to examine. If the plague is spread in the house, it is a malignant eruption in the house, it is impure. The house shall be torn down, its stones and timber, and all the coating on the house, and taken to an impure place outside the city. Whoever enters the house while it is closed up shall be impure until evening. Whoever sleeps in the house must wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house must wash his clothes. If, however, the priest comes and sees that the plague has not spread in the house after the house was replastered, the priest shall pronounce the house pure, for the plague has healed. To purify the house, he shall take 2 birds, cedar wood, crimson stuff, and hyssop. He shall slaughter the one bird over fresh water in an earthen vessel. He shall take the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the crimson stuff, and the live bird, and dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird and the fresh water, and sprinkle it on the house 7 times. Having purified the house with the blood of the bird, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the crimson stuff, he shall set the live bird free outside the city in the open country. Thus he shall make expiation for the house, and it shall be pure.
Such,
Such,
go ahead.
such is the ritual for every eruptive affection, for scalds, for an eruption on a cloth or a house, for swellings, for rashes, or just for discolorations, to determine when they are impure and when they are pure. Such is the ritual concerning eruptions.
Thank you, Jay. And
You're welcome.
Justin, would you like to continue that at the start of chapter 15?
Thank you, Rabbi. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, if any man has a discharge from his flesh, his discharge is unclean, and he shall be the nature of his uncleanness due to his discharge. If his flesh runs with his discharge, or if his flesh is plugged up by his discharge, that is his uncleanness. Any bedding upon which the man with the discharge will lie shall become unclean, and with any object with which he will sit shall become unclean. And a man who touches his bedding shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And anyone who sits on an object upon which the man with a discharge will sit shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And anyone who touches the flesh of the man with a discharge shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And if the man with the discharge spits upon a clean person, that person shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and she shall remain unclean until evening. Any riding gear upon which the man with a discharge will ride becomes unclean. And whoever touches anything, what will be under him, becomes unclean until evening. And whoever lifts them up shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And whomever the man with the discharge touches, without the latter, having rinsed his hands, shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in the waters, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And an earthenware vessel, which the man with the discharge will touch, shall be broken, and any wooden vessel shall be rinsed in water. When the man with the discharge is cleansed of his discharge, he shall count 7 days for himself, for his purification, and then shall immerse his garments and immerse his flesh in spring water, and he shall be clean. And on the 8th day, he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves or 2 young doves, and come before the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the Cohen. And the Cohen shall make them one into a sin offering and one into a burnt offering, and the Cohen shall effect atonement for him upon his discharge before the Lord.
Thank you so much, Justin. We're now at verse 16. When a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and remain unclean until evening. All cloth or leather on which semen falls shall be washed in water and remain unclean until evening. And if a man has carnal relations with a woman, they shall bathe in water and remain unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge, her discharge being blood from her body, she shall remain in her impurity 7 days. Whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Anything that she lies on during her impurity shall be unclean, and anything that she sits on shall be unclean. Anyone who touches her bedding shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. And anyone who touches any objects on which she has sat shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Be it the bedding or be it the object on which she has sat, on touching it, he shall be unclean until evening. If a man lies with her, her impurity is communicated to him, and he shall be unclean 7 days, and any bedding on which he lies shall become unclean. Kath, would you like to continue there at verse 25?
Yes. Thank you, Rabbi. When a woman has had a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her impurity, or when she has a discharge beyond her period of impurity, she shall be unclean, as though at the time of her impurity, as long as her discharge lasts. Any bedding on which she lies while her discharge lasts shall be for her like bedding during her impurity, and any object on which she sits shall become unclean as it does during her impurity. Whoever touches them shall be unclean. He shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. When she becomes clean of her discharge, she shall count off 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. On the 8th day, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, and the priest shall make expiation on her behalf for her unclean discharge before the Lord. You shall put the Israelites on guard against their uncleanness, lest they die through their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle, which is among them. Such is the ritual concerning him who has a discharge, concerning him who has an emission of semen and becomes unclean thereby, and concerning her who is in menstrual infirmity, and concerning anyone, male or female, who has a discharge, and concerning a man who lies with an unclean woman.
Thank you. That's our portion. It's actually a double portion for this week. And I invite you to take out the study sheet. And I'd like to enter into a discussion about at least a very discrete part of the portion that we read by taking a look at this painting by Gustav Klimt. And just by way of background, Gustav Klimt was a painter in Vienna around the turn of the century, around 1900. Let's look a little bit at the painting first, and then we'll contextualize a little bit more about the environment within which Klimt was painting. This painting is called Hope 2. He actually did another painting called Hope, and actually the original title for this painting was called Vision. And people were looking at it, and they began to call it Hope 2, and that's what it became known as. It is a painting of a woman who is pregnant, and you can see down towards the bottom of the painting, almost as if they are embedded in the garment that's surrounding the woman herself, 3 other figures. They are 3 women. They have their heads bowed. You can see their hands are upraised, as if they are in some form of, well, it's either mourning or prayer or some contemplative moment. And then you can see the woman, if you look back at the head of the woman at the top, her head is also bowed. She too is raising her hand, as if she too is engaged in some form of prayer, some form of beseeching, some form of contemplation. And then it may be hard to tell in the reproduction on your paper, but if you look right at where her stomach is most distended, where her belly is largest, kind of a grayish circular figure, well, that is a skull. So that's a death skull. And so here we have this moment where life is about to come into the world, and there is a figure of death that's also appearing at this scene of the possibility of new life. So Klimt seems to be giving us this image of this moment of, it's a moment of transition for everyone. It's certainly a moment of transition for the woman bearing the child. And it seems to be a moment in which all those around her recognize that there's a degree of anxiety. It's not clear what the outcome might be. Is the outcome going to be one in which death is the one that prevails, or is the outcome going to be the one in which new life is the one that prevails? So a little bit more about Klimt. Klimt is painting in Vienna around 1900. And Vienna in 1900 was an extraordinary city and an extraordinary moment. It was a mere 2 generations before, say about 40, 50 years before, in which Vienna, as the center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was just emerging from medieval times. Franz Joseph destroyed, about 40 years before Klimt painted this, destroyed the medieval walls that were part of Vienna, and replaced them with the Ringstrasse, this extraordinary bit of urban planning that opened up the city so that it was no longer a conclave of merely the wealthy and the royal. It was now opened up to the middle class. And Jewish society in particular, who had just been given equal rights, took this opportunity to build homes, and these homes became centers for new music, new art, new literature, and new thinking. So within a very small period of time, Vienna became really the incubator for some extraordinary cultural creativity. We have, this is where Schoenberg emerges with this whole new system of music. This is where Freud eventually develops a whole new sense of what is it that drives human beings to act the way they do. This is where Theodor Herzl develops the notions about modern Zionism. So out of this period, we have this very rich productivity of new thought, new ideas, new possibilities in music and art and philosophy and therapy and literature. It's quite extraordinary. On the other hand, Vienna becomes the incubator not only for those rich new experiments in the arts and culture, it also becomes the incubator for Nazism. This is elected mayor of Vienna in 1897, Mayor Lugel. He becomes elected on a campaign of virulent anti-Semitism. And one of those who is listening to what this mayor is saying is a man who's there studying art. He eventually leaves and moves to Germany, and he's the one who launches what becomes known as the Holocaust, the Shoah, and that's Adolf Hitler. So Vienna is, as a city itself, has this tension between the possibilities of new life and then also the possibilities of catastrophic death. And Klimt, in his painting here, seems in one sense to be capturing this sense of being on the threshold in which one is not sure of what the outcome is going to be, but it is clearly one that is fraught with some degree of disconcert, of anxiety. So with that, and here, and actually on number 1 on the study sheet, is a quote from the Museum of Modern Art's publication about this painting, and says, "Here, birth, death, and the sensuality of the living exist side by side, suspended in equilibrium." So I'd like, in terms of our text, I'd like to take what Klimt is providing us visually, and then have a sense of the environment within which he is producing this painting, to have us take a little step back to the very beginning of our Torah portion, which is describing a woman who is in childbirth. And the beauty of the Hebrew is, my translation says, when a woman at childbirth. But really the verb, the Hebrew is saying, when a woman bears seed. And the word there for bearing seed is the word that we give to our Torah portion, Tazria. And that word Tazria comes from the Hebrew verb zarah, which means to sow, scatter seed, and in the case of a woman, to bear a child. And that language about bearing seed evokes a lot of the language from the opening of the whole creation story from the book of Genesis, from chapter 1. I have just some of that language quoted below from Genesis chapter 1, verse 11. Let the earth sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, mazria zera, fruit trees of every kind, bearing fruit with the seed in it, zaroa bo. And that word that for seed bearing occurs several times in both verses 11 and 12 in chapter 1. So this notion that we're entering into in Tazria is one of new growth, new possibilities. It evokes the whole creation story, if you will. So here we are encountering in this woman a replication of the creation of the world, in a sense. That's what it is evoking for us. So why is it then that this language that we just read seems to describe it as something either terrifying, something that is indicative that the woman is in a state of impurity? What makes this impure to be bearing a child? So I want to suggest that too often, by this point in the 21st century, living in a Western world, when we hear the words pure and impure, we immediately go to some kind of a biological or medical connotation. And that's not what I think is in the sense of the text that we're reading. It is trying to describe impurity and purity in the context of Torah has to do with the tension between not physical cleanliness and uncleanliness. It has to do with the tension between life and death. So that which brings one closer to life is considered pure. The ultimate impurity is to be focused on death, the extinction of things. And so what the protocols here that we find so much in Leviticus are trying to do is the encounter with death is a normal course of being a human being. The question is, how do we spiritually inoculate ourselves against becoming so fatalistic about the fact that death is a part of life? And so it creates, if you will, rituals that seek to help the person who has an encounter with the possibility of death or with the reality of death, to provide that person with some kind of ritual that will enable them to return back into a focus on life. And I think that is what is happening here, is that, as in the case of the Klimt's painting, which is more than 2,000 years after the narrative that we're reading here, Klimt himself is recognizing that the moment of birth is fraught. It's fraught with the possibility that it might end badly. It enters into the consciousness of the person who is giving birth, that things might not go well either for me or the child that I'm about to bear. And so imagine thousands of years before that, that the infant mortality rate must have been so high, perhaps as much as 40% or higher even in ancient times. How does one begin to move through this moment in a way that will allow one to return with some sense of renewed embrace of life. So to share a little bit of that, I want to have you turn over and we'll read a little bit about what the anthropologist Mary Douglas has said about this and how she helps us to understand. So Mary Douglas is an English anthropologist. She died just about 15 years ago. And she did some extraordinary work. She was what's known as a structuralist, a follower of Levi-Strauss. And the basic concept of that approach is that things have no inherency themselves, that everything needs to be placed within a context in order to understand it. So she wrote a couple of very interesting books, one called Purity and Danger, and Purity and Danger puts forward the argument in which she rejects that objects or actions are unclean regardless of their context. So that's a notion that she rejects. Things are not impure in and of themselves. One needs to understand the system within which people are categorizing things, and that for those who are part of that culture, that categorization is useful in terms of moving through life effectively. So for her, purity and cleanliness, that by putting these experiences into categories, that cultures can create order from an otherwise chaotic experience. And that indeed is the way, if you will, our whole Torah opens up. It opens up with this notion of life seems to be random and chaotic. And instead, Torah tries to create some kind of categories that allow us to create some kind of order out of what otherwise seems like a chaotic environment. And she wrote a book called Leviticus as Literature, and she looks at all the rituals that are involved in Leviticus and says, these are rituals that are designed to help people make sense out of what otherwise could seem random, fatalistic, and chaotic. And that childbirth in particular is a boundary-breaking experience. And when one has a boundary-breaking experience, one is now going outside of the category that has provided some sense of purpose and meaning. One has been exposed to the possibility of something that is beyond meaning. And that causes a level of anxiety that makes the individual feel vulnerable, exposed, susceptible. And that degree of vulnerability is what can cause a sense of fatalism. And so in response to that, our Levitical culture, if you will, is trying to shape some kind of rituals that will protect that person and enable them to return from this encounter with the boundless, if you will, and be able to become restored. So here is from a lovely article by Sarah Rindler from the magazine Mosaic from 2017. According to Mary Douglas, Leviticus designates as sources of impurity not things that are morally sullied, but things that by their very nature are unbounded and cannot be hemmed in. Leviticus prohibits in order to protect. The new mother is barred from entry to the temple because the boundary-breaking experience of childbirth cannot translate neatly into a covenantal temple framework. Childbirth is a process in which pleasure and pain, life and death, purity and impurity are intermingled and become inextricable from each other. So just to conclude, you take a look back at the painting done by Gustav Klimt, and then look again at what the Museum of Modern Art in its publication Highlights has written about it. Says almost word for word what we've just read. Here, birth, death, and the sensuality of the living exist side by side, suspended in equilibrium. This moment of being at the threshold is one that we all experience in varying degrees, where what we have known as what's familiar, the boundaries that we have created at some point become shredded, and we need to find some kind of ritualized way, some kind of practiced way that enable us to survive that encounter and return back into a world that makes sense. So with that, I'd love to hear what you experienced, what you saw in this text. And Rose, please.
Well, pardon me. I think it's interesting that in this same Torah portion, we have childbirth, but we also have disease. In this case, skin disease, because that's probably the only thing they could diagnose, but you can't see, you don't know about. But, the skin disease was obvious. And I think what should take to extend what you were saying, Rabbi, both of these are situations in which the person enters a different realm. With childbirth, you're entering a different realm. Your life will be forever changed after giving birth. And we all know this. Becoming parents is the greatest transition of our lives, really. More so than getting married than almost anything else. It's the greatest transition of your life. But also entering the land of the ill, of developing a disease. And the word disease means that you're disrupted, that you're not at ease. That's really what the word means. And it's the same thing. And I think both of these things, having a disease and being pregnant or giving birth, are disruptors. Your life is disrupted, so that maybe instead of saying impure, we should use the term disrupted, or an analogous term. In other words, that person's life has become topsy-turvy, and that the intervention of the priest is not, and the things about making people impure are not just, and the interventions of the priest are not just like to punish the person for being pregnant or for being sick, but to help that person through ritual process what's happening to them. And hopefully, eventually, they're giving some pathways, some rituals to bring the person back into the community, back into where they were before. They may be changed somehow, but coming back.
Yeah, so it's beautiful what you said, Rose. And I just want to, again, you mentioned the skin diseases. So that is just as a perfect physical representation of what spiritually is being talked about here, because it is the breaking down of the barrier of the skin, and something seems to have erupted from within and coming outside the skin. And that sense of there being a breaking of barriers, the crossing of borders, seems to be the theme that we're experiencing here. And then I just want to acknowledge that what is called here in the offering, the second offering that the woman is to bring is here called a sin offering. And once again, because of the world in which we have grown up, we immediately think, oh, sin offering means that she's done something wrong. But from our high holy days, we know that the word for sin doesn't mean that. The word hate means that one has veered away from a path, that there's been some kind of divergence, that there's been some kind of detour, some kind of astrayness from the, if you will, the sided direction in which will lead to a healthy life. So what she's really doing here, Rose, is what you've described, which is she's not bringing a sin offering because she's done anything wrong. She's bringing an offering that will help her to emerge from this traumatic, anxiety-producing moment and restore her back onto a path. So
Yeah,
thank you.
so it's a disruption, not so much the sin. Like, it's not your fault if you get a skin disease, you know, or whatever. It's just
Right,
that
so-
your life has been disrupted.
So yeah, I like that. Disruption is a nice way to put it. All right, others? Richard?
I think of the word unclarity. That the enigma of human life with life and death always at stake in a delivery room. And skin eruptions of what's coming out from the unconscious onto the surface. And I don't think of it as an impurity. Impurity is lack of clarity, lack of light. And I think of the solution that is offered is the washing. It's kind of like PTSD treatment. That there's been a great disruption as someone who's been in a life where there's combat. You don't know if you're going to win the war or lose the war, become a hero or become a corpse. And there needs to be something to set that disorganization, that disruption back into wholeness. You need to be washed for that. It's a missing the mark as what sin is supposed to mean, because the thinking has been disrupted. So I agree with both of you.
Thank you. And then let me get to thank you, Wendy. Let's hear from you.
Okay, a couple of things about the painting. You said there were 3 women. There's
Yeah.
also, this could be a man over here. There's a 4th person on the very right-hand side, on top of the one lady who has brown hair and brown shirt on. There's some face there. I don't know who that is. And then there's another woman over here.
It's flowers.
There's 4 people there.
Okay.
Now that was just so I'm thinking, when a woman carries a child, she is a vessel. And that vessel, it belongs to the Creator. The Creator has created in there. And it's 1 second between death and life at every single moment of the pregnancy. It could be death, or it's just it's so minute we can't even really fathom it. And so in childbirth breaks through that vessel somehow, and all that was like I think I had in my head, but I can't really tie that into anything. But also, when you're pregnant, you're thinking about that child all the time. Your attention is not on God, it's on that child all the time, and you're kind of separated. I think you're a vessel but you're separated, because that's where your all of your attention, and you can see she's looking down and she's like only attentive to there. She's very focused. So I'm thinking in sin in a very much more broad way of having to come back to God.
Yeah.
So that's sin offering, bringing her back.
So this notion about bringing it back, I just want to share, it's very interesting. Within the Talmud, there's a lot of commentary about all this. And some of the commentary has to do with this notion about this so-called sin offering and the notion of coming back. And as you've just been mentioning, Wendy, so there's this commentary that says a woman is in labor and she's yelling and she's screaming because of out of pain, and says, never again will I have intimate relations with my husband if I have to go through this again. And so the notion is that this, as Rose has put it, this disruption, this momentary, this traumatic experience, this bursting of barriers and borders that causes her to also say something that potentially would take her away from life, that is intimate relations with a husband and the possibility of producing more children. So the sin offering is again this offering as a way to help her get through that moment and restore her back to once again wanting to have intimacy. Yeah. So Jay.
Just looking into my version or my edition, specifically in 14, 12, etc. They call it a reparation offering, and there's an elevation offering. And I don't know if those two words are the same ones we're referring to, but the Hebrew being translated that way makes a lot more sense to me. And then also, can you comment on something that I discussed today, was that the leprosy has been compared to Lashon Hara, to the spread of someone who is spreading the evil tongue, the tongue, bad tongue. And there are commentators that see this as an allegory, as a comparison to that. Have you heard any of that type of commentary, Rabbi?
Yeah, and we'll see that a little bit later in the story having to do with Miriam, where her skin breaks out in this kind of a condition. So if you want, we can discuss the notion between the skin disease and its treatment as it relates to gossip when we get to the story of Miriam. Happy to do that. Thank you. Okay. And any others?
Oh.
Okay.
Well,
Yes, Steve.
does it say what the age of the person is?
The age of the person?
Right.
No, it doesn't say anything about the age of the
Because
person.
I think that's really important, because reading through this, I've had these skin eruptions all over my body, and I've felt like the priest was my dermatologist, looking at everything and describing what kind of medication. And she said at OHSU that it's due to the lowering of the immune system, and that's how things break out. And it usually occurs with older people.
So here's something you got me to think, which is that in this day and age, we do tend to think about medical doctors in some way as priests of a certain kind.
Yeah, almost worship.
Oh, yeah, and we almost, at least at a certain time, I don't know if we still do, have attributed, the status of that doctors have about power of life and death and their capacity to work miracles of all kinds. And what's interesting is that how in the last 20 years or so, in medical schools have introduced into their curriculum what we call narrative medicine, which is that the importance of speaking with patients rather than merely relying upon lab tests and exams of all kinds. That the capacity to speak and to draw out the context within which someone is living provides great helpful insight into diagnosing and treating the physical representations.
Oh, yeah, she does a lot.
Yeah.
As well as taking all the lab tests.
Yeah. So let me call upon Joni and then David and Susan. Yeah, John?
This is very convoluted, perhaps. But rather than, well, first of all, in some of the commentary, they say it's important for us not to think of this as a public health discussion.
Yeah.
That's not what's going on here. But I also think that we're looking at it only at the negative aspects of it. And that what I'm seeing is these are situations that people feel like they have, that aren't necessarily negative, that they have no control over. And this is an opportunity for the priest to demonstrate their, I don't want to use the word power, but to demonstrate their ability to help deal with situations that people can't necessarily deal with. This isn't just about eruptions. And the childbirth piece, it's a beautiful thing. And childbirth is one of those that's the creation, and that kind of supersedes all these other things that happen in our lives. And with the skin eruptions, I mean, we're not just talking about that, we're also talking about secretions of all kind from both men and women. Those aren't negative things, but they are phenomenon that occur in human life that the priests can't control. Like they can't, but they want us, I think they want to be able to demonstrate that they are part of that society where they can demonstrate their ability to try and answer something that they really have no answers for. And so there's all these rituals to try and compensate for that.
So I'm glad that you brought in the notion about things that one can't control. And I appreciate that as you're also introducing the notion about presenting the priests as these figures of authority and that they have. And I just also want to kind of also highlight the notion that just on a broader scale, that what Torah here is acknowledging is there are things that happen to us that are not our fault and they're beyond our control. And Torah as a whole is saying, and you should not be punished. You should not be held accountable for things that are beyond your control. We can create a system that takes account of those things and that treats you so that you can move through those experiences that you have no control over and are able to rejoin, come back into the camp, if you will.
But not so benevolently. I mean, there's a lot of there's an awful lot of, I think, unnecessary restriction in order to kind of create a system, some kind of judicious system of what's right and wrong when there isn't necessarily what's right and wrong.
So it's interesting to see, so you're focused on the hierarchical authority that's being created here. And then it's interesting, of course, when one looks at the arc of Judaism to see what happens to that notion of authority and how that becomes more dispersed. And eventually we no longer have a center of authority. We now have many tables around which there's authority. So let me call upon, lots of hands in that now up. Do you have, Kath, go ahead, and I'll call on some folks who've got their hands up there.
I was thinking about overall, because all they can do are these outer body things or things that come out to the outer body because they don't know what's going on inside the body yet they're doing all of these tearing apart animal bodies and see things inside. And I just thought that was an interesting kind of juxtaposition. I also thought it was interesting that cleansing for a boy child is shorter than cleansing for a girl child. That was interesting to me, and I didn't quite know what that's about, but it always feels like there's this implication that there's this inherent uncleanness of women.
Okay.
I mean, the isolation with the blood and all of this, there's sort of this overall thing with that. But I also felt like a lot of what this is about is really trying to protect the greater group. And it's not necessarily that when one has these things, it's bad, but the goal is get them out so that they're not going to contaminate everybody inside.
Great. So let me just pick up on one point about how that if it's a female child, the woman is isolated for twice as long as than for a male child. So once again, the notion of impurity is not something that is a moral, is not a moral judgment.
Right.
What it's expressing is that you have touched something that has gone beyond our normal living within finite categories. And so the woman, by giving birth, has in effect become a representative as replicating that which we read about in Genesis, the creation of the world. The woman is now channeling that awesome power. And so when she gives birth to a female child, that female child carries that power within her as well. So it is a doubling of the, if you will, the awesomeness of having touched that creative power that powers the universe. And so there needs to be a doubling of protection, a doubling of enwrapment, a doubling of a way to recover from it.
It's the goddess.
It's the goddess. Okay. So let me call upon David and Susan and Mark and Robert. Please, David and Susan.
Perhaps irreverent comment, but what struck me was how often a 14 or 15-year-old boy would have to visit the priest every day in many cases, because nocturnal emissions are almost chronic among some young males.
Okay. So again, for that 14-year-old, 15-year-old boy who may be terrified, at least initially, as to why is this happening? Why is this coming out of my body? What is this experience all about? Well, in our society, we can either leave that boy to magazines in his bedroom to figure it out for himself and get through this early puberty on his own, or we can offer some kind of reassurance that it's one, not his fault, that two, there is a way to return into a sense of that this is can be a wholesome thing, that that is part of what you're participating in, a touching upon the powers of life, and instead of using it destructively, which is what sometimes can happen, to use that power in a way that puts you back, reorients you, going back to Rose's important contributions here, that gets us reoriented back on the path of wholesomeness and sanctity, rather than embracing the negative, destructive powers that also that represents. Let me call upon some other folks who haven't had a chance yet. So let me call upon Mark and then Robert.
Thank you. I'm glad we're meeting tonight. It kind of gives me an opportunity to unload some of my emotional feelings right now. My dearest cousin, my favorite cousin, has just been diagnosed with leukemia, and he's going to have to go in for a lot of chemotherapy and maybe a bone marrow transplant at some point. And I'm thinking, this Torah portion affords us an opportunity to re-enter the community once one gains ease and health. It doesn't talk about that space of this equilibrium, that space of uncertainty that my cousin is going to be facing. And, it occurs to me that, well, of course, prayer is the ritual that we might have to help us in this situation. I'm just feeling like this Torah portion doesn't give me a lot of comfort and a way of dealing with my own sadness right now. And I just wanted to put that out there.
So first, we hope that and pray that your cousin not only will be in the hands of wise, skilled, and compassionate medical people, but also that he will be surrounded, as I'm sure he will, given the family that you're all a part of, that he will be surrounded by a comforting presence that will enable him spiritually and psychologically to be a participant in his healing. And
yes, he is.
Amen.
So that is our hope, our prayer, and we know that you will be a part of a healing presence for him. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Robert.
Well, thank you again for a lovely evening. And Mark, I'm saddened to hear about your cousin. So maybe a little later you can visit. It's interesting. What came to my mind was the markets. Stocks, bonds, that kind of thing. And here's why. the one thing the markets don't like, and I think it's true in every avenue of life, is uncertainty. And what came to my mind before the markets was the concept of gratitude. That these individuals, and I want to add two words that you mentioned, comforting, reassurance. And somebody mentioned reliance. And another word of my own would be peace of mind. That having these answers to these issues must have given the Jews at this time. Imagine if there were no guidance for any of these. But here an individual could go to a priest. It was ordained that they do this. They could have it analyzed, and they could have peace of mind. They could have comfort. They had reliance on the priest. They had trust in them. They had reassurance. And I think they must have had gratitude. As an aside, you recall part of the scripture talked about white on the skin. So I spent a tour in Vietnam in the upper highlands, Pleiku, and my arms were white. Now, if you look at my skin tone, being Middle Eastern, you know, I'm not like a German, but it was actually white because of the damage that the sun had done, or the fungus apparently had done because of the moisture in the sun, but yet it never was anything that would lead to any kind of sickness or anything. They had a little something they put on it. But if I go out in the sun and spend a lot of time, you can see those white spots come back. And my arms were pretty much white. And the last thing is, you know, you mentioned purity and impurity. And what is more beautiful than a pure heart, pure intention, pure character? And that leads to a spiritual life. And what is more sad than impurity of character, impurity of intention, impurity of action, leading to the death of a spiritual life? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Everyone, so beautiful, and appreciative of everyone sticking around a little bit longer for this double portion of these very, very profound issues that we've been talking about. And I'd like to conclude with this. During our discussion, Joni mentioned this issue about authority and the priests creating for themselves this position of authority. And it's interesting, in the Talmud, there is a discussion about what we just read tonight, about white skin and white hair and black hair and then yellow, and the in the Talmud, there's this, the rabbis are having this discussion, and they imagine that up in heaven, there's this debate going on about, well, what if the patch of skin is this color and the hair is this color, and what are you supposed to do? And they're debating it, and all of a sudden someone says, you know, Rabbi so-and-so, he's really an expert on this stuff. Why don't we bring him up here to the Heavenly Academy and invite him to teach us the answers to these questions? And what that story is basically saying is that authority has transferred from on high to down below. That heaven itself doesn't have answers to all these questions. That
That's like the story of the mother.
it has been left up to us. And by us, I don't just mean rabbis sitting in some academy debating it. I mean us, all of you who are here, who are participating in trying to find meaning, trying to create for ourselves and within our communities those rituals that will ensure that people, when they do come in contact with what appears to be the possibility of oblivion, that we have the capacity to create relationships and to create rituals that will ensure the capacity of people to spiritually, emotionally, psychologically survive those encounters and lead a holy and wholesome life. I'm very grateful for all of you for participating in that work. I look forward to seeing you all next time. God bless you all. Be well.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night.
Shabbat shalom.